I want to welcome everyone to Superhero's Journey, Truth, Justice, and the American Way, a conversation about protagonists in iconic films and comic books. What can they teach us about the transformation of our own grief and losses? How do these stories inspire us to find purpose through acts of service and justice? This event is the third program in Reimagine's four-part series, Grief, Growth, and Justice. I hope you will check out recordings of the series online. You'll get those links in a follow-up email from Reimagine, along with a recording of this event. The final program in the Grief, Growth, and Justice series is on May 18th. It's a conversation about justice and healing for veterans with some of the most inspiring advocates and activists who have served in the military and have played a role in bending the moral arc of the universe towards making things right. I will be putting links in the chat about these events. My name is Andy Engel. I am senior programmer at Reimagine. I'm in New York, known by its indigenous inhabitants and their allies as Lenapehoking. Tell us where you are in the chat, and also tell us what superpower you'd like to have to care for the people of this planet. I think my superpower at this moment would be to transform the Supreme Court of the United States. For those who may not know, Reimagine has refined its mission and vision. In the past, we focused primarily on breaking taboos that surround death and dying and celebrating the precious time that we have together. That has not changed. What is different is that our conversations have broadened. We want to reimagine how we face the hard parts of life and transform them into meaningful growth and action. So here at Reimagine, we've been leaning into the theory and practice of post-traumatic growth. For those who have experienced trauma, research indicates that truly shattering experiences can cause debilitating anxiety, as well as emotional and physical distress. We all know this as PTSD. Now I'm going to tell you a bit about PTG. This is another body of psychological research suggesting that it's possible to grow, learn, and transform from trauma, loss, and other adversities. And now I'm going to quickly go through some of the outcomes for post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth outcomes include an increase in personal strength. That old adage, what doesn't kill you make you stronger. Number two is recognition of new possibilities or opportunities. We can shift old habits and patterns. Number three, improved relationships with others. A crisis can strengthen bonds between people. Appreciating life. There's good stuff around us that we may have overlooked previously. And spiritual growth. Our core beliefs are shattered when we experience trauma. In order to rebuild, we often ask those big existential questions. And if we're going to be talking about justice, I think it's important to have a definition. We like this one, courtesy of our partners at Holistic Underground. Justice is a state of integrity and wholeness, achieved through healing and transformation. And Joyelle, we can talk a bit more about that term healing. When justice is present, we can trust that our safety and well-being are valued in a community or society. So, what is the genesis of today's discussion? In preparing for the Grief, Growth, and Justice series, I came across this new anthology from Routledge called Superhero Grief, The Transformative Power of Loss. One of its editors and two of its contributors are on this panel. I thought this collection of essays was such an original and unique way to talk about loss, grief, and post-traumatic growth. And the title of this event, Superhero's Journey, references the hero's journey, a personal transformation described by the mythologist Joseph Campbell. It's a blueprint for so many fairy tales, as well as comic books and movies. In order to overcome challenges, the hero or the superhero has to face his own anxiety or their anxiety, face their fears and confront losses. But he, she, or they don't have to do it alone. What I've learned from Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Storm, Black Panther, etc., that it's essential to have a crew or a Justice League when times get tough. And why at Reimagine are we interested in comics? We want to break taboos that surround discussions of grief, loss, and mortality. Comics, too, are loaded with a history of stigma. They aren't considered literary. And beginning in the 1930s, moral crusaders claimed that comics corrupted the minds of young readers. And this event also is an extension of our interest in graphic medicine, which is an offshoot of narrative medicine, which some of you might have heard of. There's been research in the use of storytelling in comics, graphic novels, and graphic memoir to train doctors and nurses to be more empathic. Comics can give medical providers opportunities to reflect on the stories of others who are different from them, and then provide space to discover their own narratives. So now I'm going to stop this share. There we go. Now I can see all of you. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Jill Harrington, who will introduce our Justice League of speakers. You can find the complete bios of all these speakers in the original event listing where you RSVP'd. Dr. Jill Harrington has been practicing social work for over 20 years with a special focus on trauma, loss, and bereavement. She maintains an active clinical counseling practice. She is the lead editor and creator and contributor to Superhero Grief. Please give her a warm Reimagine welcome. Now, Jill, superheroes all have their origin stories. Tell us, what is the origin story of your book?
So first of all, Andy, I want to thank everybody for inviting me here today for Reimagine. I've gotten to know Reimagine, what a beautiful, beautiful community there is here. So everybody wanting to come here to kind of join in community to talk about really the destigmatization of loss and grief. I mean, this book was about creating a Justice League. We talked about this, a Justice League of grief, to create a more grief-informed society. Myself as a thanatologist and my fellow thanatologists that are here today. You know, none of us would actually be here if, I always say that grief and loss, bereavement is a form of survival for human beings. Because if you think about it, all of us are here because those who came before us somehow survived the loss of their loved ones from time immemorial, across all of humanity and across all cultures, religions, and groups. So my origin story starts, I'm a product of, I was born in, I'm going to date myself here. So a 1970s child born and raised in New York City. My mom was from Queens. My dad was from the Bronx. And back in 1981, my sister underwent something. She had a life-threatening disease and was hospitalized in Long Island Jewish Children's Medical Center. My mom at the time worked in medicine and worked alongside a woman who was there who revealed her secret identity to us. My sister was really sick and I was under the age of 16. I couldn't visit her in the hospital. And a woman who worked with my mom said, you know, my brother's been in town, and I told him your story about how your daughter is really undergoing this completely stressful, life-threatening event, and her sibling is crying and worrying about her, and he wanted to send them nice cards. And it happened to be that her brother was, if you look behind me, there's a personal portrait there of Batman. Her brother happened to be the co-creator of Batman, Bob Kane. And he spent several, you know, sent us several cards and things of his own volition, just to like cheer up two kind of distressed kids who were born in Queens and raised on Long Island. My sister survived, but that kind of, for me, you know, being a kid who grew up in New York and loved the comics and sort of in the bourgeoisie place of a lot of the comic book creators. My dad went to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, the same place that Stan Lee and Bob Kane graduated from a couple of years later. But, I grew up watching Wonder Woman at 4 o'clock after school. People tend to forget back in the 70s, we didn't have streaming TV. We had like 3 channels and the ubiquitous U channel. Like, what was that all about? Like, and it's typically in black and white and then in color. So, you finished your homework, came home, maybe you watched Batman, Wonder Woman, the, $6 Million Man. But fast forward a little bit, I went to social work school in New York, Delphi University, then later on at University of Pennsylvania. But it was with my work in New York after 9/11, working at South Shore Child Guidance Family in Freeport, New York, where we were basically responsible for, as part of Project Liberty, we were providing services to families affected by 9/11. And I had a young kid in my practice who would come in every week because he was voluntold by his mom to come in. His uncle had died in 9/11. And he was a young kid from Queens. We were ethnically and culturally very different. And, we sat in silence. I'm a therapist. I learned as a child therapist to sit in silence many times, with children to gain trust. And about the 11th or 12th session where he didn't want to be here, he walked in with a Batman t-shirt. And I opened up the conversation with him. It was sort of a trust building. I said, "Oh, why do you like Batman?" And he started talking about Batman. And that was our therapeutic bridge. That was our alliance. That was our connection. And I began to weave in that story, the fact that Batman too had had his parents killed on the streets of Gotham in New York. And that really began for me, the opening up this aperture of using what I love, superhero narratives and stories, which are, modern day mythology. They're human stories written by humans for humans about the human struggle, about the human journey. And there's lots of different human journeys. But, superhero stories, they connect us because most of them start off with a traumatic, violent death loss. And that's a catalyst. The death loss, and particularly the violent death loss of a loved one, is a catalyst for how people, what their pathway, what those decisional points in their pathway that they make. And so, it's the ultimate test of the hero's journey. It kind of separates heroes from villains in a way. And that's not saying that a hero has a clean path whatsoever, period. Superhero stories were basically called out on that they were too perfect. And that's why a lot of Stan Lee's characters then kind of had human flaws in them. And then DC kind of got on board with that as well. But getting back to my story, then in 2009, I was at the Association for Death Education and Counseling. After many years of being a social worker, watching these superhero narratives weaved into my clinical practice. I worked in oncology, where both patients and care providers kind of wore that hero's emblem to, the archetype for strength and hope and other things to kind of, I wear my Wonder Woman archetype. She kind of gives me power and strength, but, with all her strength and power, she still has a shield because she has vulnerability. She carries a sword and has a shield, because she has vulnerabilities. But in 2009, at the Association for Death Education and Counseling, I was sitting with Dr. Kathy Shear from the Center for Complicated Grief at Columbia University. And I had Batman on my screen. I was a doctoral student. And she asked me, "Jill, what's that?" And I was like, "Oh gosh, I'm a doctoral student. I might totally lose my credibility here by saying that's Batman and he's a homicide survivor. And I have this idea about writing a book about superheroes and grief." Well, I told her, and I asked her, I said, "And one of the things, if you Google Batman and conditions Batman suffers from is complicated grief." And I said, "Would you ever be interested in talking about that?" And she said, "Yeah, that would be really interesting." So fast forward to 2018, and we did a panel at the Association for Death Education and Counseling, which is for us thanatologists. Tashel's on the board, Joelle knows about it, and has been to some of our meetings. And I've been, it's our professional home as thanatologists, thanatologist meaning Thanos, meaning death, and ology, meaning the study of death and dying. In 2018, we did a panel. I got a panel together, and we looked at the Christopher Nolan series on Batman Begins through the lens of, I had 4 experts there: Dr. Kathy Shear through a complicated grief lens, Dr. Erwin Sandler from Arizona State University looking at family resilience, Then I also had Dr. Phyllis Kosminski, who teaches at Fordham and has a private practice looking at attachment, and grief. And then Dr. Robert Niemeyer, who looked at it through meaning making, a meaning making lens. And we were all dressed in psycho. I was dressed as Catwoman. We had Batman there in the chair. And they each looked at it. It was very actually beautiful and serious at the same time. And then right afterwards, Dr. Niemeyer came up to me, who was the lead editor of Death, Dying, the Bereaved, and Serious for Routledge, and the publisher came up and said, how would you like to do a book on using pop culture of these superhero narratives as a teaching tool, and as also a tool for those who are bereaved, who could pick it up and maybe connect with their grief? And I said, I could talk about the Batman all day, but he said, well, what about all superheroes? And I said, now you're speaking my language, because as a mother of a child who has autism, a superhero fan myself, and one who has lost many people in my life, this has been our language for the last 20 something years. This is how, as a parent of a child with autism, you try to connect in any way you can with your child, whether it's through music, rhythm, the arts, and a lover of the arts. So not only was I using it in professional practice, but I was using it with my own son to help him connect with his own grief, his loss, other tragedies in his life. And so that was really basically the origin story. I looked at, for me, I'm kind of like Tony Stark wearing that helmet and Friday's talking to him. When I look through all these films, I just see, being a thanatologist, a person who teaches about grief and loss, specifically more bereavement, and who also is a therapist. When I watch these movies, if you look at them through the loss and grief lens, things just start popping out at me. The things like Black Panther and Ancestral Connection, Superman and Continuing Bonds. So I created all these chapters, wrote the proposal, and then reached out to I called it my Justice League of Grief. Those who in my world could really write about each of these concepts. And two of them you have here today, Joelle Mahiran and Tashelle Bordera. And I'm also really honored to meet Yona Harvey. So that's my origin story, Andy. And the origin story of superhero grief.
Thank you. Jill, do you want to now introduce our first speaker and maybe ask a question to them?
I do. Do you want me to introduce all three or just one at a time?
I think one at a time, so it's fresh.
So, all right. So I'm going to introduce, so we're talking about creating a world more of justice for those who bereave. So I would like to introduce to you someone that I met several years ago, who is a dear colleague and now friend of mine, Joelle Mahiran, who spent over 15 years advising high-ranking politicians, including former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee and former First Lady Michelle Obama. After the death of her daughter, she founded Evermore to change policy, as well as, oops, sorry, Joelle, didn't need to do that, as well as advance, yep, I don't know where the rest of my things are, but sorry.
Advanced research and make it a more livable place.
Advanced research, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Research and make a world a more livable place for the bereaved. I apologize that's my human flaw. I just didn't have my paperwork. So.
No, I was sitting on the edge of my chair thinking, what is it that I said? So
advanced research
for having
a world a more livable place for us, Joelle.
I'll certainly trying. And thank you for having me. And I'm so humbled to be here because, well, for a lot of different reasons, but certainly to be considered a superhero is not something that I'm referred to as often, although maybe I should add that to my bio now, Jill. Thanks. Thanks to you that some have referred to me as Superman. So I don't necessarily see myself as Superman, I'll have to tell you that. And then when Jill asked me to write about my work and think about Superman's story, I had to admit to her that I have a first grader, and the extent that I know about Superman is from the little books that we read together at night. But I have learned a little more. I am definitely no expert, and so I'm incredibly humbled to be here. I often say that the death of our daughter really informed my experience with grieving and loss and bereavement. But I would never say that that is my purpose. And I know that that might sound slightly disconnected, but what ended up happening is after my daughter died, I would wake up many mornings getting ready to go do the work that I was doing at the time, which was for the, again, to advise the Obama White House. And I was waking up to news cycles and realizing how many families were about to experience very profound personal losses in their life. So there was Trayvon Martin, Hydea Pendleton, Sandy Hook, Chicago homicides, the Washington mudslide, Jasper tornadoes. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And I really felt that the work that I had done in obesity and childhood obesity, it started with Mike Huckabee and then moved later to Michelle Obama. I really felt that the work that I had committed to do for those individuals and for associated institutions for those causes, I had really done what I said I was going to do for them and helped advance the issue on a national stage. And so I quit my job and I began walking the streets of Washington and walking all over DC in many places where, frankly, I didn't fit. But people began opening their churches and their homes and the police stations and their therapy offices to me. And they all began to tell me stories of their own experiences. At the same time, one thing that I didn't mention in my bio is I'm a basic scientist by training. So I am very keen to look at what is the latest researchers like Michelle doing and trying to understand the basis of the science. And what I started to do was marry the stories with the science. And I suddenly began to realize this was a problem of terrific magnitude and scale. And that's because, and one of my insights early on was CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, measures mortality, but they don't measure who survives those deaths or what the implications are. And so we now have concurrent mortality epidemics in the United States. We have for several years now. And in fact, I'll come back to this in just a moment, my work in Washington, D.C. But from these personal conversations in the science, I'm going to tell you something that we all know, and that is that the death of a loved one isn't simply just a personal tragedy. There is a ripple effect in your life, and there are additional victimizations, I call them secondary victimizations, that begin to happen to the individual because of the systems surrounding them. And those systems are not configured to support you at a time when you're most vulnerable. And so I began talking to Washington politicians, both Republican and Democrat. I'm one of the only people, frankly, I know that has worked with both sides of the aisle for many years. I began talking to Washington, D.C. lawmakers about my concerns pre-COVID about the concurrency of mortality epidemics being homicide, suicide, overdose, and maternal mortality. And again, with each individual who died, there are now multiple people who had a close relationship with that person. In fact, the way I talk about it on Capitol Hill is that when you are exposed to the death of a loved one and you have a close proximal relationship to them, it's almost as if you receive a high dose of radiation. And you are then left to try to figure out how to digest that radiation. If you're a first responder, you may not have a close proximal relationship with that individual, but you may have a slow and chronic exposure to radiation events that can make coping in your daily life very difficult. So I won't get into a lot of the politics and give you a really wonky presentation. I did begin to see a lot of symmetry between various death events and the systems that surround families. And so I began proposing policy work and amendments to federal legislation and federal vehicles that would begin making bereavement a priority in the United States. And so I, again, won't get super nerdy here, but we have effectively attached bereavement for the first time to the US budget, and that happened first under the Trump administration, and it happened again under the Biden administration. We've also had language that now CDC will be, is encouraged now to be capturing data and providing tools to states and other groups to begin measuring the scale of bereavement. Again, related to a mantra of what gets measured gets done. And the last thing that I'll just say that we led last year was first, job and wage protection and Build Back Better, that bereavement leave would become an eligible event, or bereavement would be an eligible event for employers who were large enough to participate in the Family Medical Leave Act. And so ultimately Build Back Better did fizzle, but we made some pretty substantial progress in who would be considered a family or a significant loss, as well as a couple of other things, but I think most importantly, just not only job protection, but wage protection, which is incredibly important for people. So I'm going to end my comments here. There's a lot more I could say, but frankly, coming back to the Superman, I think, we really all are in some ways like a Superman. We experience something significant and a loss in our life, and then we do what we can with what we know for people around us. And what I happen to know in this field was DC politics and policy and how to work that world. I'm not a clinician, I'm not an artist, I'm not a dancer. So I see this type of work transpiring in communities across the country. And again, I'm just really thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So Joelle, though, even though you're DC, I gave you the assignment of looking at DC Comics. So I gave you a pretty big assignment looking at Superman and Spider-Man, and you wrote this chapter on parental grief and activism on becoming your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and learning all about both of these characters. And then you particularly wrote about Spider-Man, because Spider-Man, suffers the violent death of his Uncle Ben. And then really he doesn't want to join with the Avengers because he wants to stay in his neighborhood. He wants to be a friendly neighborhood. He wants to protect his neighborhood. And you kind of wrote about on becoming your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, because you're kind of protecting the neighborhood for the bereaved. So when I asked you to write this chapter, I want to really be honest here. What were your original thoughts, and what do you think about it now?
My original thoughts were, holy smokes, I'm not qualified to do this. And again, was very flattered. I did think Spider-Man was more apt because, and this may be very juvenile for you, Jill, but the bite of the spider I felt was very akin to sort of the intense shock and then the transformation that began with Spider-Man. And then I also felt that the net that he casts in many of his stories, I felt was somewhat what I was trying to do. But for the blow, I wasn't going to change anyone's exposure or bite to loss. But if I could just change the systems around them and cushion them a little bit more in the fall, then I would consider my job to be done.
Yeah, so that radioactive bite, I know you talk about in your chapter, and then talking about, with great power comes great responsibility, because sometimes when we take on these things, with Evermore now, there's, taking on a great responsibility to help others around you. What's that experience been like for you? Just really briefly.
So it's, again, been very humbling. I do have a pretty sincere sense of passion around this, because I think that there are a number of injustices that individuals and families often experience in the aftermath. And it shouldn't be that way. And I think the federal systems and the state systems, and frankly, your local community systems, should be configured in a way that help you when you're down, and help you stand back up again. And we're getting there. We're slowly getting there, and we're making progress, but it is an enormous mountain to climb.
Well, I think I'm going to find a lot of Joyelles in the multiverse, just to let everybody know here. So like, you might come back as a pig, because there's Pig Spider-Man, and then there's like older Spider-Man, and then there's a whole bunch of different Spider-Man. So I think somewhere we're going to meet, you might be connected with your Joyelle in the multiverse. So, but trying to do the same thing, creating that advocacy, because you know what? Change has there's a trickle down effect with change. We can help people on an individual level, but without that systematic change and that justice there. And we thank people like you that really are out there calling to help those who are grieving and bereaved, and understand the impact that loss, can have on people. And that, even though it's a normal and natural thing we all go through, it is the most distressing thing for all human beings. So thank you so much, Joyelle.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us from the same area. We're in the DC region. I'm going to now turn to Dr. Deshelle Bordair, a good dear friend of mine from ADEC, and dear professional colleague and friend. She's a certified thanatologist and assistant professor of human development and family science at the University of Missouri. Her essay on Black Panther is included in the Superhero Grief Anthology, and her research focuses on grief and loss among African American youth. She's the co-editor of the Handbook of Social Justice in Loss and Grief. And I'm really honored to be here with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Deshelle Bordair.
As am I. Thank you for having me. Reimagine, and I'm hoping that everybody on this call will continue to reimagine ways that we might contribute, recognizing that each one of us on this call carries a superpower, at least one superpower, if not multiple ones. So I guess just really briefly, are you asking me a question? Or am I moving forward? So what got
ask you a question? I'm going to ask you a question, because you and I ask questions of each other all the time. But the question I'm going to ask you is, because I had to go around with my own professional integrity around my colleagues, like kind of did with Dr. Scheer. The devil was on one shoulder, the angel going here, and like this, the devil was voiced a little bit louder, saying, "Just ask her." As a doctoral student, all my credibility was on the line. I came to you and I said, "Hey, would you be willing to watch Black Panther and look at it through this lens?" What were your thoughts when I asked you to do that?
Yeah, well, first I'll mention, Black Panther is the first Marvel film that I have seen, but not the only, due thanks to Jill introducing me to the Marvel world. But I can tell you that I did not grow up with Black superheroes in the media. I have a lot of Black superheroes in my life, my uncle, my grandfather, and so many other men in my life, and women, by the way. So I didn't grow up. So Black Panther was a huge deal for my household personally. And so it was imperative that I take our daughter to see the film and witness all of the brilliance that gets overlooked in Black communities. It's a loss for Black communities that those strengths are not acknowledged more. So I want to say that. So it was personal. So however, I was not familiar with other films. So when Jill presented it to me, I had mixed feelings, but I can say that they were kind of joyful ones. I enjoy creativity. Although I'm an academic, and some things can be formulaic, I've always appreciated the arts. I write poetry myself. At some point in my life, I'll get to do more. And so I've always, even in my academic writing, I've always found ways to bring in multiple voices, even Lil Wayne at a point. Lil Wayne has even been in some of my work, W.B. Du Bois and so many other scholars. So I've always walked, so I appreciated this opportunity to delve more into my creative side and look at this film through a more critical lens. I for sure was keen to the issues of loss and grief because it's my area of study, Black bereavement. So it gave me another opportunity to watch the film like 4 or 5 more times and have all of these incredible conversations with Jill, who I will say this was one of the most engaging writing processes that I've ever engaged in. You know, we debated about this film, which I think is important in terms of understanding loss and grief. You know, I originally went into this film, we talked about me focusing on T'Challa, whose father, and I'm guessing that most people on this call are familiar with the Marvel Universe. Yes, kind of. I'll give a brief summary of the Black Panther, just so that to give it some context. And actually, I'll say a couple other things about myself so you understand my positionality. A lot of my work is written through a social justice lens. And so I look at a lot of the things that Joyelle mentioned just from a research standpoint. I look a lot at context when understanding loss experiences. Like it is central to consider context. It is central to consider systemic oppression and things like that impact marginalized communities of various different backgrounds, right? Whether it's race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, whatever the case is. And so that's kind of that's my lens. And I also look at trauma and loss and homicide in particular in Black communities. When she asked me so as I was writing this chapter, it was really important for me to be able to highlight, so brief summary. Joe, you can help me out if I don't get it all in. I'll give a very brief summary. Okay. So in the Black Panther, if you haven't seen it, go see it. Please go support that film where there's, you know, one of our few Black superheroes. We need you. Keep them, get those numbers up. We need more of this. My children need more examples of this in the media, as do other kids of all backgrounds. T'Challa and N'Djaka.
Spoiler alert though, T'Challa. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Meaning spoiler alert, we're going to let people know what happens a little bit.
Okay, a little bit. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think it's still worth the film. I won't say everything. This is a snippet, I promise. But there are these two, you might in fact look at it with a deeper lens now, because again, we're bringing our backgrounds and research and years of this to this process. Years of me studying Black populations and grief and youth, particularly Black male youth. So there are two cousins, one of African ancestry, Wakanda, from Wakanda, and his cousin, who is also, his lineage is also African. He also has an African heritage. In fact, he has an African name that he doesn't get to use. So he takes on an American name, Eric. And then eventually he takes on the name Killmonger, right? And so I really wanted to highlight similarities and differences between these two individuals who are both perceived as people of color, males of color, African ancestry and African American ancestry, and look at their parallel experiences and the differences. I will say that Jill, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, really wanted me to focus on T'Challa.
I did.
And she did. However, I actually, when I looked at N'Djaka, and many people were angry with him because he ultimately, they both experienced, although they come from different economic statuses. So T'Challa, his father died violently, although they're a wealthy family with all of these scientific advances. Eric, his father also died violently, and they did not have a whole lot of money, right? The bottom line is we know through research that it doesn't matter. Socioeconomic status does not matter when it comes to violence and Black male death, that Black men in particular have the highest rates of violence, are at risk across socioeconomic statuses. Whether you go to an HBCU or you go to Harvard, you are still at risk for dying violently at the hands of a person who looks like you or a law enforcement officer. Again, there are great officers out there, and there are some who are a product of their experiences and also stigmatized, dehumanized, and ultimately more likely to pull a trigger on a person who they view as threatening, a Black male. So in any case, So they both experienced the violent losses of their fathers. In Ndjaka's case, or Eric's case, his father died at the hands of his uncle, T'Challa's father. Now, here's what I want to say briefly about this. That's also important in terms of violent death, because when people die by violence, it is most often somebody who's known to you, just like sexual assault and a lot of other things like that. And so there's that level of betrayal too. So their coping processes are different though, you all. Although they're both bereaved, their coping processes are different because T'Challa had been prepared for the death of his father his entire life. And although he was bereaved, he inherited wealth, resources, surrounded by a family of support. And I'm not saying that one experience is better or worse than another, but what I will say is compared to T'Challa, whose experiences are very much worthwhile, Eric grew up without parents, right? Both parents died. He lived a disenfranchising life with 3 different names. You know, W.B. Du Bois talks about the plight of Black populations and having to live in 2 different worlds all the time, have to know your world and another world. You add GLBTQ, LGBTQ to that, and you're living in 3 double consciousness, or 4 or 5. And so his plight was very different. In fact, his family disowned him because his father married somebody outside of the race. So Eric, I'll stick with Eric, his American name. Again, he inherited basically 3 names, Eric and Ndjaka, and then Killmonger, because he grew up being more violent. Okay, he processed his grief through anger. Anger is very much dismissed. Anger is very much looked negatively upon when it comes to grief. We know that it doesn't matter your background. But what I really wanted to foster, and you know, that's very similar to the youth I study. I've been doing research. I've done research on youth in New Orleans, Kansas City, more recently Black female college students, and it really doesn't matter. Oftentimes the losses that are experienced by violence feel very unjust, and anger is very normal, right? It's particularly when you lack resources. So when Eric's father died, he was left with nothing. In fact, his Wakandan family flew away on their ship, or whatever it's called, and they abandoned him too. So when we talk about a youth who does not have all of these resources that Joyelle is trying to fight for, that I'm trying to fight for and advocate for through my research and writing and presentations, we have to expect that and also I want to say this too, Eric experienced multiple losses, which we also see in Black populations. Doesn't matter your income status, Black people differentially experience a death disparity. We will experience across our lifetime, we will experience more losses than other populations, than white populations. I'll say that because we can't be afraid to say white. If we can say Black, we can say white. All right, so we would differentially across our lifetime experience multiple losses. I have to wrap up. I just got a message, but I do want to say this as I'm coming forward. This film, Eric represented a lot of the Black male youth who I've worked with and given a chance to share their voices through my research, who are also experiencing a whole lot of reactions, not just anger. We only see the anger. They're sad. They're trying to play it cool. They're having to repress a whole lot of their feelings just to survive, and they get critiqued for that, right? So they're oppressed. Oppression is when you're damn if you do and you're damn if you don't. All right, y'all. And so as I wrap up, I do want to say that when a child is dealing with is in a system where they are there's no real space, you know, no luxury to be able to grieve. Grief is a luxury for a lot of populations, not you know, to keep moving forward. Black populations in general are charged with being strong and playing it cool because the repercussions are greater. Punishment is swift when you're marginalized. And so in any case, one other point I want to throw out, because I do think this is important. Suffocated grief, not just because I came up with it, but that I came up with it because I need to express this as the voice of the people I've worked with. Eric experienced, I came up with the concept of suffocated grief through my research, largely with Black populations, but it applies to all. And that's the notion that some groups are differentially penalized for their grief, right? And so we see that with Eric, right? He was differentially penalized for having normal grief reactions. It's normal to be angry. It's normal to be sad, particularly given all of the losses and betrayal he had dealt with and was left alone to contend with. yet he was going to be much more likely to be penalized, punished, and talk to people who saw the film and watch how they talk about Eric. I'm not condoning his violence, but I want to say if you don't give a person another tool, they're going to externalize in ways that they do have power to externalize. If there's no police protection, then these youth are going to have to protect themselves. So just keeping this real and keeping this conversation honest. It was a pleasure to be able to talk about privilege and oppression in this chapter and really take a, expansive look at it. So I'm excited. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to hearing from our next person, but thank you.
Gosh, Tashelle, I could listen to you all day. I'm serious, but anger is a normal reaction to grief, right? I mean, like even T'Challa experiences it. We see this in Winter Soldier when he's consumed with vengeance, because we know by the work of Dr. Ted Rynearson, who it was the first to really study violent death bereavement, that a violent death, particularly a homicide, but any violent death can really, he calls it the 3 V's. It sets forth a path on a human experience of violence, violation, and volition. And that volition of somebody taking from us what is ours, we want to go reclaim it, right? And so T'Challa, even in Winter Soldier, he's consumed with vengeance at this point. He says, when he sits down and he talks to I forget it's escaping me right now, but the guy who's part of he's trying to get the Avengers to fight themselves. He says, vengeance has consumed you, because his wife was killed in Age of Ultron, and and he says it's consuming them. I'm not letting it consume me. Justice will come soon enough. That's Black Panther's moment where he decided to not go down that path of anger anymore. But it's what you do with that anger. And he had a model and support systems and other sort of resources and other privileges that his cousin didn't have. He didn't have the other multiple losses his cousin didn't have. So I want to thank you I asked you to look at Black Panther, T'Challa, but you opened up my eyes to look at Eric, Killmonger to Jaka, and really his loss, his grief and loss journey. So.
And even I have to say, don't y'all think that's an awful term? Killmonger? And he was a Killmonger. I mean, he did kill.
He was. I
don't condone violence. I don't even use love dots. I don't even let my students use bullets. It's love dots. And don't fire me an email, send it. So I don't use violent language to the best of my ability. But just think about the stigma and how how this identity was imposed on him, and he self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And he didn't have time like T'Challa. T'Challa had time to grieve. Eric had no time to grieve. He had time to go from one experience to the next to survive. And so I want to say this to you, Andy, too. There's sometimes when we start out talking about post-traumatic growth, and I also caution us with that sometimes, because you shouldn't have to grow through some awful experience. Sometimes we don't grow. We're trying to survive. And that's the group I work with. So yeah.
And there's an inherent story flaw, because nobody graduates the Naval Academy at 19. So that's another story for another day. With that said, because they wrote that in the story, I'm going to now introduce Yona Harvey. Thank you so much, Tashelle. Yona is the author of 2 poetry collections and a 2022 Guggenheim Fellow. She co-wrote Marvel's World of Wakanda, a companion series to the best-selling Black Panther comic, and co-wrote Marvel's Black Panther and the Crew with Roxane Gay. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, I want to make sure I say that correctly. She has worked
Ta-Nehisi.
What?
Ta-Nehisi.
Ta-Nehisi Coates. She has worked with teenagers in writing about mental health issues. I'd now like to turn it over to Yona Harvey.
Thank you. I feel so lucky to be in this company. I've just learned so much over the past 50 minutes. It's been great. I sort of feel like all the work I've done, the writing and comics, has led me here. So I'm really grateful to Andy and to Let's Reimagine for this space and this conversation. Thank you so much. I just wanted to share a little bit of my origin story and some background about where the writing comes from. So, most of my work is anchored in poetry. That's how, my first publications are in poetry. But later on, around 2015, 2016, I was invited by Marvel to work on a collaboration for the World of Wakanda anthology. So that's how I came. My love for comics and interest in comics became more public. It was always there. As a child, I was really fascinated by the Peanuts, both the Sunday comic and the occasional holiday or seasonal cartoon specials that they would have. In particular, I was drawn to Charlie Brown just because he had such a difficult time. I don't know why I identified with that character so much, that's not a typical character, for kids literature or cartoons, so there was just something interesting, like, why does this kid have such terrible luck all the time? And why does Lucy yank that football away every game? Why does he trust her every time? What's that all about? That used to just, puzzle me as a kid, because I feel like my environment was much more controlled. I was my mom is very religious, and my sister and I were, I'd say, a little bit overprotected. So everything was very, orderly, seemingly orderly. It never really is that way, but people think that they're doing things to control dangers, adversities from coming into the home or whatever, right? And so a lot of that was upended when in 2007, my sister committed suicide. So there were just a lot of things around her death that opened up a lot of tensions, of course, and, changed relationships in my nuclear family and my extended family. And in particular, I label my sister's death as suicide, but my parents do not. And so that is a huge source of tension that exists to this day. Even the fact that I can be in a semi-public Zoom talking about that in a way that I don't really talk about it with my parents. So there is that. So what I draw from that now as a maker, as an artist, is thinking about that conflict between Charlie Brown and Lucy. That is life. That is the story. There is no avoiding the conflict. There is no story without some kind of conflict or strife. Like, life is change. And so I really did delve into that world so much more when I shifted to storytelling through comics. So the first character I was invited to write about, her name is Zenzi. And Zenzi in the comics is really the thorn in the Black Panther's side. I guess some people might label her a terrorist. I can remember Ta-Nehisi asking me when we first took on the story, he was like, how are you going to write about this character who sets off bombs in Wakanda, who harms the Black Panther's mother? So I really had to think about, why she would do that. And the first thing was to not label her a villain. I feel like she was a very complicated person. And the person who came into my mind at that time was Winnie Mandela. And I saw Winnie Mandela as complicated, then I still see her as complicated now. She was imprisoned. She was sometimes overshadowed by Nelson Mandela. And then, of course, if you follow the history of South Africa, you also know that at one point in her life, after they were separated, she took very drastic means in order to, fight back. So a lot of violent things happened. But I always see her as just a complicated figure, and I don't like to see her get dismissed. And because, when you think about male political figures, they're not dismissed in that way. There's all these readings and articles and biographies and this and that and the other. But for her, I feel like there was less of that. So that's all to say, I really drew from that. I was I guess, yeah, I was an undergraduate when I was really studying South Africa more deeply, I guess. So I drew from that experience again when I thought about Zenzi. Like, who is this woman who really doesn't think the Black Panther is all that? And in fact, wants to topple his entire way of running Wakanda. So she lived on the border. She lived in a country called Naganda, and Nagandans, many of them felt like Wakanda had taken some of their riches. So these are the things that we don't necessarily see in the film. We don't hear about these things in the films, maybe later though, in the next round. So anyway, I drew from that. That was just very important to me. And it just kind of unlocked this space of imperfection and complication around characters in a way that I just couldn't access through poetry. There was just something about poetry after the loss of my sister that was not working for me. And so having the opportunity to write for World of Wakanda kind of renewed me and brought me back in a way that was affirming, and it put me in contact with teenagers who were writing about mental illness. It put me in contact with a whole other community of adults who were writing about either their own struggles with mental illness or a relatives and how that impacted their families. And it got us just talking in a very open way about trauma and death, all these things that were super important. You know, they sort of come up thematically in poems, in poetry, but in terms of community, I felt that was lacking for me. And so comics, graphic novels were very important. I have a great graphic novel and comics nerd community here in Pittsburgh who helped me, you know, think about these stories and just the backstories of these people walking around Pittsburgh. They're so great, you know. So all of that sort of tied into the storytelling. Also, I want to say I worked on Black Panther and the Crew as a second round for Marvel. So I did that collaboration with Ta-Nehisi Coates. And in that story, there was a mentor, Ezra Keith, who dies in police custody in Harlem. And so Black Panther, Storm, Manifold, Luke Cage, and Misty Knight all come together in Harlem to sort of figure out what has happened to their mentor. And so again, through this series, each character is kind of working through their relationship with that mentor and also their relationship to the larger group, things that they've kept from one another. So again, this death of their mentor has opened up these channels of communication that were previously untouched, closed, you know, so they're learning more things about each other. So through that process as well, that just helped me open up as an artist. And again, as a community member in comics. So very important. And then the last thing I want to just highlight is my teaching, how working with the comics impacted my teaching. So all of this work allowed me to do work with the teenagers, and then on the college campus, writing and making comics. And just the way that the students opened up around that, and the way that I could dig through the archives and find good Marvel stories, good comic stories, things to bring in. So one of them that I just wanted to highlight tonight is around the Hulk. And so there's also a version, at one point it was called She-Hulk. And this is Bruce Banner's cousin, Jennifer Walters' story. But eventually they dropped the she and just let her be Hulk, which I thought was great, a really good feminist move. But essentially she is in the comics anyway, she goes into battle. It's during the Civil War, not American Civil War, but Civil War as in the Marvel universe. And then she gets injured, she goes into a coma. And when she comes out of that coma, she finds out that her cousin, Bruce Banner, was killed. And so it just opens up all this trauma for her. There's all this backstory, and you find out like why she's hulking has to do with PTSD. There's a lot about stress. So again, these stories allow the students to connect and open up in ways that they don't necessarily in other classes. The last class that I taught actually for this, I had a really great student. We all had pen names, so I think I can say her pen name was Lady Froglegs. That's, nobody will ever know who she is. And so she talked in that class about her mom overdosing, and she had never written about that. And she drafted the first drawings, and it's one of the best stories I've read ever in my teaching career. And just the fact that she could have that moment, that comics allowed that to happen for her, I thought was crucial. And that is definitely why I do what I do and why I believe in this panel. And I'm so grateful for Jill's work and everyone here. So thank you.
Oh, to unmute myself, Yona. I mean, you brought up so many things. First of all, Power Man, talk about the also a story where betrayal and loss are so intertwined, right? But also how there's multiple pathways. I mean, loss is a human experience. Death is a human experience that we're all going to experience. It's just a matter of who, where, and when, and why. It's what connects us all. But you also talked about how what was working for you didn't work for you anymore after your sister's death. And I hear this often from folks. So you speak to the multiple kind of ways that people may need to process or cope with their pain. I have a great friend and colleague, Sharon Strauss, who started the Christian Rita Foundation after the death of her daughter by suicide, who died by suicide. And she's an art therapist. And, psychotherapy wasn't working for her after about a year or two. And she turned to this thing she knew, which was art, and started processing it through art herself. And sometimes people find that they use art and then they need psychotherapy. So there's multiple ways people can turn to for support or to process their pain. But oftentimes art is a container. It's an external container where you can put a lot of things, in these imaginative stories that you can process a lot for yourself throughout that journey of either writing, journaling, painting, creating. I mean, I hate to say this, but a lot of our creation comes born out of that pain and beauty can coexist, kind of like, the song that opens up Deadpool 2, Let Beauty Come Out of Ashes. And Tashelle was talking about, like, most people don't experience post-traumatic growth when they're surviving. I'm going to argue that point, because it is not the actual event that causes us to grow. It is the struggle with survival. And that there can coexist distress and survival and growth at the same time, that are fighting to survive something that's so devastating. Even though we may have negative things that happen to us, we can discover things about us. And we even see that with Eric's journey at the very end. Eric's journey at the end, where he and his cousin kind of bond, and he opens up for the first time and talks to his cousin. For that, he grew in that way. He was able to connect with somebody in his life and talk about his grief and his pain. So with that said, we have about
I want to come back to that real quick. So you also notice he chose death over staying around though. So what I'm proposing is not that people can't grow or change, because we all are changed by our experiences. I'm different than I am right now than I was 5 minutes ago, right? Because I've heard these other stories and things like that. What I'm trying to say is sometimes that can be the connotations are different when it comes to some communities, and we use language like that. When we use language like prolonged grief disorder, right? With a Black child who's already been taught that they're get all of these messages already from society that says that you're not human and you're not cool. And so post-traumatic growth, what I'm proposing is that when you deal with injustice after injustice after injustice, and somebody's like, well, be thankful for that almost, because you're going to grow. It can be infuriating for those populations, because and for me, I think growth is awesome, but I also think celebrating strengths is even better, right? So what did it take for you to do that? It also kind of sometimes can dismiss the strengths that are already there, like, these incredible cultural rituals that are there. It's a strength that that resources are shared, that collectivism is a strength of a lot of marginalized populations. So that was already an evolutionary, that's a form of kind of resilience that you've maintained the whole time. So that's kind of what I'm saying. So I guess I don't want to, I'm glad that you brought that back up, because I'm not saying that a person can't grow, but what I also want to
No, and you're right. I mean, like sometimes like the invalidation that goes along with, oh, you could just grow through this, or,
yes, it dismisses your experiences sometimes. It can dismiss your grief. Yeah.
Michelle, I want to bring up this point about the importance of language that you pointed out with post-traumatic growth for particular communities. I want to bring that now to Joelle and an exchange that we had about the use of the term healing and grief for the Evermore community. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. There are a lot of different words that we don't use that might be more common in other venues in this field. But my comment to Andy about healing is that it's not a word that we use. Healing is more often for someone else feels the need for you to heal in order for them to sort of move on and feel better about where you are. You're never going to say to a mother of a murdered child, or we would never say that at some point this would be a healing event for you, or you'll find healing through this. We also don't use the word resilience, because we believe that it's how many hits can somebody take, rather it's weathering, how many hits can somebody take before they can't get up anymore. And so I'm often saying these things to federal agencies or lawmakers, because we really, in those instances, we're really placing a personal accountability on the individual to heal or to be more resilient. And I often say, in fact, I said to a very senior government official last week, if you can't sit in front of a mother who's lost 2 or 3 children to gun violence and just tell her to be more resilient, then I would suggest your entire agency stop using that word. We frame things slightly differently, but healing and closure and resilience and so forth are not words that we use in our practice.
Resilience also has this like sort of A to B experience. Like it's linear. It doesn't have, resilience can also be just a person like getting up, brushing their teeth, or maybe even crossing into a therapist with their heart and their soul in their hand, coming to see a person. It takes an utmost amount of strength. I work with a lot of families that have been bereaved, but, by different types of different deaths and different relationships. But I had a mom whose young son died by suicide. And, 4 weeks after his death, she came into my office. And the fact that she actually brought herself into a stranger's office, brushed her teeth that day, put on her clothes, and came to talk about the most devastating thing of her life. Like that's, and I often talk about this in the book, is that strength is not something magnanimous. Strength is the strongest thing on earth is a spider's web, which can be both fragile and strong at the same time. So when it comes to verbiage, sometimes I also take my lead from the bereaved person who's talking to me. If they want to use the word commit suicide, I go with that, but I don't normally use that word because it, connotates a moral and legal sin. But if the survivor wants to say that, that's fine with me. If they want to say, I want to feel resilient, that's fine with me. But you're right, Joelle, about how we kind of also place these expectations in terms of, like, we never use recovered or recovery or resolution, that these, you never resolve someone you've loved. If like death is permanent, love is permanent. So grief is permanent. It's never gone. We just learn to live somehow with our losses. Do we want to have any ending comments or questions from anyone? I think we have a couple of minutes left.
If anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand. If not, then I want to thank this group of super heroines. Oh, there is a question. Brad Wolf, Executive Director, founder of Reimagine, has a question.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm listening in the car and I've been just so moved and inspired by this session. I was very, very excited to be here and hear what you're talking about. Because as you know, at Reimagine, as Andy's maybe described, we're really working hard and thinking about this idea of externalizing or channeling our experiences through, whether it's creativity or through our relationships with maybe through our relationships with nature, through like what can we, how do we metabolize our experience, right? And I guess I'm really interested in Dr. Taschel, what you were saying about language, and we are really thinking hard about how can we talk about, I love this idea of strengths, and are there terms that you collectively in this group would recommend to talk about this experience of channeling something into something? I don't know, channeling our grief or our pain into something. Is maybe the word channeling or transforming growth, and what are we channeling it into, I guess, is another question. There's creativity, there's meaning, there's purpose, there's all these words that are positive, and I understand how for a lot of communities, you know, that's, I don't know, it kind of puts this, I understand what you're saying, and so I'm just trying to figure out or think through how we can talk about this in ways that feel okay for everyone.
I know that question was directed at you, Taschel, but I'd like to reframe what we think of as strength. You know, I talked about in the book, and I talk about often that, you know, reframing what we think what strength is. I mean, again, you know, strength could be just facing the day after your child has died, you know, and making sure that we acknowledge that, because I think we have such misconceptions of what it is to be quote unquote strong. And sometimes being strong is really being able to be vulnerable and say, I'm not okay. I'm in pain. I'm hurting. I don't have to put on this game face. Like I need a day where I can just lay in bed, eat Ben and Jerry's and do nothing. And it's okay. And not be perceived as being weak. I'm not sure, Taschel, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to briefly add to the notion of I also focus a lot on not necessarily having to channel it, because that's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work to have to be played emotionally, to be emotionally cool all the time, or to, you know, just continuing on what Jill was mentioning, is space to not have to channel it, like that space to feel safe when they come into our clinical office, right? Or when I'm doing my interview, space to not have to turn it into something else. Can we just sit with another person's pain? And I love Joan Halifax's work about that, being with pain, you know, how to be with people's pain without feeling like we have to do something, and acknowledging the strength that it encourages and vulnerability that it takes people to do these very basic steps. So I do see strength also as kind of on the spectrum, right? The strength you have to carry every day of your life, even without a loss, that we see among people who are part of intersecting marginalized communities and identities. There's a daily strength, so a loss can just further chip away at the you know, your resources. So for all of us, for me to message it as I think is we're all trying to create spaces for that, for safety, to be with your pain in a space that will feel safe, whether it's, you know, arguing, whether it's talking with politicians and lawmakers and things like that, or doing art, or seeing Jill in your clinician, seeing Jill as a clinician in her office, like we're all trying to create space. I'm guessing that you all are too, trying to do the same. And that's one of the best gifts we can offer, right? And follow the lead of bereaved people, their language, as Jill mentioned too. And many outlets. I want to say this is the last thing I do want to say. Yona mentioned like art and how, you know, finding herself in a different space allowed her to do that. Like she changed her cognitive label. she found herself in a different space that allowed her. And that's also what we can do to help people, instead of necessarily, you know, they might grow in all of these things, but can we help them find another place to live and breathe and feel human again? And you know, in their essence. So that's what makes us the Justice League. And everybody on this call, right? We're all working towards that. So thank you for this opportunity.
Michelle, I think that's something that we as an organization, as Reimagine, need to strive
Yes.
for. Finding that balance between, okay, we can talk about growth, but we can also talk about just sitting with the grief and showing up for folks. And if they don't
Yeah.
want to go at that moment, that's okay.
Yes.
So I want to thank all of you, Yona Harvey, Tashelle Bourdaire, Joyelle Mulheron, and Jill Harrington for this fascinating and creative conversation. I'm going to be sending out a follow-up link with resources for all of you, some contact information for our speakers, the recording. Oh, and thank you for posting that, Tashelle. And I also want to mention that we have upcoming programs at Reimagine. We've got our next and final Grief, Growth, and Justice program in the series, focusing on veterans. I put a link in the chat. And we just encourage you to support Reimagine also. So consider a donation to make this possible and to keep this free. Everyone, I wish you all a beautiful night. And thank you again. Have a good evening, everybody.
And Andy, I want to thank you and the folks at Reimagine for trying to destigmatize grief and to create this justice to help promote a more grief-informed society. Thank you for having us here tonight, and thank you to everybody on the panel. And thank you so much, Yona, Tashelle, and Joyelle.